Welcome to this chapter on the rebuilding of the 62TE transmission. This chapter is divided into three parts: teardown, subassemblies, and reassembly. In this part, you'll learn about the subassemblies for this unit. My name is Bill Brayton, and I'll be your host for this chapter. It's a great day to fix transmissions, so let's get started. Now, to begin the disassembly of the underdrive unit, we are going to remove the retaining snap ring down inside the sun gear. We can use the small snap ring pliers for the job. Open the snap ring and lift the sun gear up at the same time. Next, remove the underdrive sun gear and the split bearing. On later model units, this bearing may not be there. The factory has determined it's not needed. Now let's remove the direct drum from the low drum and transfer shaft. Next, remove the one-way clutch. Now remove the bearing retainer and remove the drum from the shaft. Now we are going to disassemble and assemble the direct clutch. Let's start by removing the snap ring and the direct pressure plate. Next, remove the pressure plate to clutch hub bearing. Notice the flat side of the bearing faces up. Next out is the direct clutch hub. After the hub is the thrust bearing. Notice the bearing has the flat side up as well. Next, remove 12 one-sided direct clutches. Now use a press to remove the retaining snap ring. Remove the balance piston, the return spring, and the direct piston. Always use new molded pistons and always soak friction plates a minimum of 30 minutes prior to installation. Reverse the process to assemble the drum. Now before final assembly, we're going to check clutch clearance. Let's install the 12 one-sided frictions into the drum, then install the pressure plate and snap ring. Now let's use an angled feeler gauge to get between the frictions and the pressure plate to measure direct clutch clearance. Clutch clearance should be 37 to 56 thousandths and is adjusted by changing the pressure plate. There is the pressure plate kit from the dealer with the part number up on your screen there. Now once the clearance has been adjusted, install the thrust washers and the direct clutch hub. Finish the drum by installing the pressure plate and snap ring. Remember, the flat side of the snap ring faces the drum. To start the disassembly of the low clutch, remove and discard 2 sealing rings. Note here the earlier drums have rotating sealing rings. The rotating rings in the aluminum housing was a bad combination, so every one of them needs to be replaced due to severe wear issues. The non-rotating rings came out in 2012. Now remove the one-way clutch if it hasn't been removed already. There are a couple of things to note about the one-way clutch. First, the flat side of the one-way clutch faces up. Second, there are 2 sets of blind splines. The one-way clutch holds clockwise and freewheels counterclockwise. Next, let's remove the snap ring and remove the low clutch pack. Use a suitable press to compress the return spring and remove the snap ring. Now remove the return spring and the molded piston. Here's a look at the various low drums. The early drum with the rotating rings are always worn out at the ring lands. The later drums have non-rotating rings and the side clearance is pretty sloppy. The aftermarket rebuild clearance is the aftermarket rebuild drum has had the aluminum ring grooves machined off and replaced with a steel sleeve, which has a tighter clearance on the sealing ring groove. This last drum is the drum that you should be using in every rebuilt unit. Clean and dry all low drum components. Always use a new molded piston. Lubricate the piston and install it into the drum. Use a suitable press to compress the return spring and install the snap ring. Temporarily install the low clutch pack and pressure plate to check clutch clearance. Next, use a feeler gauge to check low clutch clearance. Clearance should be 19 to 30 thousandths and is adjusted using different thickness snap rings. Now to finish the low drum assembly, install 2 tab sealing rings into the groove. Okay, now let's get to the one-way clutch. We can identify the top from the bottom by the step on the bottom of the one-way clutch. Also notice the inner race has a black side, which is heat treated, on top and a plain side on the bottom. There are 2 offset blind spines, so the race only goes into the low clutch one way. Now let's start the disassembly by removing the snap ring, the top spacer, and the top oil channel washer. Next, remove the inner race, then the cage/element assembly, the bottom oil channel washer, and the bottom spacer. Notice the notch side of the cage/element assembly faces up and the smooth side faces down. After all the one-way clutch parts have been cleaned and inspected, reverse the procedure to assemble the unit. After the one-way clutch is assembled, hold the outer race and turn the inner race clockwise. This is proper operation for the one-way clutch. Okay, after all the other compounder components have been serviced, we can put new sealing rings on the transfer shaft. First, use a pick to break the 4 rings. Next, use a small amount of assembly gel in the ring grooves to hold them in. Install 1 green and 3 white scarf cut seals. Before we assemble the drum to the transfer shaft, temporarily remove the low clutch pack and sprag from the drum. Now install the drum onto the shaft. Next, place the assembly into a hole in the bench or on a holding fixture. Now line up the bearing retainer and place it on the drum. Now install the bolts and use a hammer to tap that retainer down into a place. Next, run the bolts down and torque them to 108 inch-pounds, 108 to 109 inch-pounds, okay? Before we go on with the underdrive unit assembly, we're going to temporarily install the shim and the transfer gear to check bearing preload settings. First, place the bearing shim on the transfer shaft and install the transfer gear. Next, install a new nut. Now install the special tool Miller number 9739 onto the transfer gear and torque the nut to 200 foot-pounds. Next, check the turning torque using an inch-pound dial torque wrench. Turning torque should be between 8 and 18 inch-pounds. If more than 18 inch-pounds, choose a larger shim and recheck turning torque. If less than 8 inch-pounds, choose a smaller shim and recheck turning torque. After checking turning torque, remove the nut, the transfer gear, and the shim and set them aside. Now we can turn the assembly over and install the one-way clutch. The one-way clutch will rotate counterclockwise and lock clockwise. Next, install the low clutch pack and the snap ring. Now install the direct drum onto the low drum and transfer shaft. Now after the direct drum is on the low drum, we can install the underdrive sun gear into the direct drum. You can see we are not installing the cage needle bearing that goes under the sun gear. The OEM has determined that this needle bearing is not needed and has discontinued production of the bearing. Later model units do not have this bearing. The last step is to slide the snap ring over the transfer shaft and down into the groove. Now set the underdrive unit assembly ready for transmission. Now set the underdrive unit aside so it's ready for transmission assembly. There you go. Now we're moving on to the front pump. To begin the pump disassembly, remove and discard the pump O-ring if that hasn't been done already. Next, remove and discard 4 sealing rings. Now remove 6 pump bolts and remove the stator. Now after the bolts have been removed, split the pump halves and remove the pump gears. You can see the dots on the gears face up. Next, remove the front seal on the pump bushing. Now that the pump parts have been cleaned and dried, we can inspect for wear. Inspect for gear wear on the stator. Also inspect the screens on the stator. Inspect the bore for sealing ring groove wear. Inspect the pump pocket and the crescent for wear. Now we can drive in a new bushing. Drive the bushing in just flush. Next, turn the pump over and stake the bushing. You can use a punch or a blunt chisel for this operation. After the bushing's been staked, be sure to deburr the area. Now, after the bushing is in, turn the pump body over and install a new front seal. Next, lube the pump pocket and install the pump gears. The dots on the gears always face up. Before final assembly, it's always a good idea to check pump gear clearances. This is especially true if the pump gears have been replaced. Use a feeler gauge to measure inner gear to crescent clearance, outer gear to crescent clearance, and finally outer gear to pump body clearance. All clearances should be 4 thousandths or less. Next, we're going to check pump gear to stator clearance. Place the plastic gauge on the gear so it lines up with the flat area of the stator. Install the stator onto the pump body and torque the bolts to 20 foot-pounds. Remove the bolts and carefully separate the halves. Measure the plastic gauge for the instructions supplied. Gear clearance should be 2 thousandths or less. Now, place the stator onto the pump body and install the 6 bolts and torque them to 20 foot-pounds. Next, install 4 new sealing rings. Now, to complete the pump assembly, install a new pump O-ring. This will conclude the underdrive assembly and front pump part of the 62TE transmission. We want to thank you for participating in our virtual training solutions powered by ATRA. Until next time, let's keep fixing transmissions together.